Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we find ourselves in a quiet suburban driveway, sometime in the late 1990s. The sun has set, streetlights cast a gentle orange glow, and the only sound is the distant hum of a transformer. A car pulls up to a closed garage door. The driver, with a casual press of a small plastic button on the sun visor, initiates a silent, invisible conversation. A tiny red light on the remote flickers, and an instant later, the large door begins its slow, reassuring ascent. This simple act, repeated millions of times a day across the country, feels utterly mundane. But the signal that traveled from that remote was a cryptographic puzzle. A password used once and then immediately discarded forever, part of a complex digital handshake designed to be impenetrable. To truly understand the quiet revolution that made this everyday moment so remarkably secure, we must trace the meticulous evolution of an unseen suburban battleground, the radio frequencies that guard the American garage. To begin, we must first appreciate the garage itself, not merely as a structure, but as a cultural and architectural phenomenon that set the stage for our story. Before the widespread adoption of the automobile, the garage's ancestor was the carriage house, a separate, detached outbuilding where one would keep horses and carriages. It was a utilitarian space distinct from the main residence. As the automobile began to replace the horse in the early 20th century, these carriage houses were often the first structures to be converted. However, with the post-World War II suburban boom, a profound architectural shift occurred. Visionary builders like William Levitt standardized and mass-produced homes for returning GIs and their growing families. A key feature of these new suburban landscapes was the integration of the garage into the home itself. First came the attached garage, connected to the house by a breezeway, and then, most significantly, the fully integrated garage, with a direct door leading into the kitchen or a mudroom. This integration transformed the garage door from a simple barrier for a vehicle into a primary point of entry for the home. It became a new front door, one large enough to drive a car through. And with this new status came a new set of challenges and opportunities. The earliest overhead garage doors, pioneered by C.G. Johnson around 1921, were a significant improvement over the old swinging barn-style doors. They were sectional, hinged panels that ran on tracks up and along the ceiling, saving space and being far easier to operate manually. But manually was the key word. For decades, opening the garage door meant getting out of the car, often in the rain or snow, lifting the heavy door, driving in, and then getting out again to close it. The demand for a more convenient solution was palpable. The first electric garage door openers began to appear in the 1920s, with Johnson's company introducing one as early as 1926. These early systems were rudimentary, often involving a key switch on a post at the end of the driveway or a button inside the garage. They were a luxury, complex and expensive. The true democratization of the automatic garage door opener began in the 1950s and accelerated into the 1960s, driven by companies like the Alliance Manufacturing Company, which would later become Genie, and the Chamberlain Group. The key innovation was the use of a radio transmitter, a small, handheld device that allowed the homeowner to open the door from the comfort of their car. This brings us to the dawn of our specific era of focus, 1970. By this time, the automatic garage door opener was no longer a niche luxury, but an increasingly common feature of the American suburban home. The technology that powered these early remotes was elegant in its simplicity, and also, as we shall see, in its profound insecurity. The system was based on a fixed code. Inside the handheld remote control was a small circuit board, and on that board was a series of tiny switches, typically 8 of them arranged in a row. These were known as dual inline package switches, or more commonly, dip switches. Each switch could be set to one of 2 positions, on or off, representing a binary 1 or a 0. Inside the garage, the receiver unit mounted on the ceiling had an identical bank of 8 dip switches. For the system to work, the pattern of the switches in the remote had to exactly match the pattern of the switches in the receiver. When the driver pressed the button on the remote, the transmitter would generate a simple, low-power radio signal. This signal was modulated or encoded with the specific binary sequence set by the DIP switches. For example, if the switches were set to on-off, 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 the remote would transmit a signal representing the binary code 10101. The receiver in the garage was constantly listening on its designated frequency for this exact code. When it detected the correct sequence, it would close a relay, activating the motor that lifted the door. It was a straightforward and effective system. The number of possible codes was determined by the number of switches. With 8 switches, each having 2 possible positions, the total number of unique combinations was 2 to the power of 8, which equals 256. Some later models expanded this to 10 or 12 switches, offering 1,024 or 4,096 combinations, respectively. In the early 1970s, this seemed like more than enough. In a sprawling suburban development, the odds of 2 neighbors happening to choose the exact same DIP switch setting out of 256 possibilities were considered relatively low. However, this calculation overlooked the realities of human nature and the density of suburban living. Homeowners rarely set the switches to a truly random pattern. Many simply left them in the factory default setting, often all on or all off. Others might choose a simple, memorable pattern like alternating switches, or the first half on and the second half off. This dramatically reduced the effective number of unique codes in use. The result was a common suburban annoyance of the era, the phantom garage door opening. A person on one end of the street would press their remote, and a neighbor's garage door 2 blocks away, sharing the same frequency and DIP switch code, would unexpectedly open. It was a quirky inconvenience, a small price to pay for the magic of remote access. This simple system operated within a very specific and highly regulated environment, the radio frequency spectrum. To understand the evolution of garage door technology, one must first understand the role of the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. Established by the Communications Act of 1934, the FCC is the United States government agency responsible for regulating all interstate and international communications by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable. The radio spectrum, the range of electromagnetic frequencies used for communication, is a finite natural resource. Without regulation, signals from different devices would constantly interfere with each other, creating a cacophony of unusable noise. The FCC's task is to slice up this spectrum, licensing specific frequency bands for specific uses, such as AM and FM radio broadcasting, television, cellular phones, military communications, and aviation control. Garage door openers, along with other low-power consumer devices like baby monitors, remote-controlled toys, and early cordless phones, fall into a category of regulation known as Part 15 devices. Part 15 of the FCC rules sets out regulations for unlicensed radio frequency devices. These are devices that are considered to have a low potential for causing harmful interference to licensed services. They are permitted to operate without an individual license for the user, but they must adhere to strict limits on power output, and they must accept any interference they receive from other sources, licensed or unlicensed. During the 1970s, the most common frequencies allocated under Part 15 for devices like garage door openers were in the 300 to 400 MHz range. Specific frequencies, such as 300 MHz, 310 MHz, and later 390 MHz, became de facto standards for the industry. The choice of this frequency range was a technical compromise. Lower frequencies would require impractically long antennas on the remote controls to be efficient, while much higher frequencies would have shorter range and be more easily blocked by obstacles. The 300 to 400 MHz band offered a sweet spot. The antennas could be small loops of wire embedded in the remote's circuit board, the power requirements were low, and the signal could reliably travel the short distance from a car in the driveway to the receiver inside the garage. The simplicity of the fixed-code DIP switch system, however, contained the seeds of its own downfall. While the problem of neighbors accidentally opening each other's doors was an annoyance, a far more significant vulnerability began to emerge in the late 1970s and became a serious concern in the 1980s. The fixed code transmitted by the remote was, in essence, a digital password sent in the clear, unencrypted, Anyone with a compatible radio receiver could listen to the transmission and identify the code. This led to the rise of a device known as a code grabber. In its simplest form, a code grabber was a device that contained a radio receiver tuned to the common garage door opener frequencies, and a transmitter. An individual with malicious intent could park down the street from a target home. When the homeowner returned and pressed their remote, the code grabber would receive and record the binary sequence from the dip switches. Since the code never changed, the thief could then simply retransmit the captured code at a later time to open the garage door at will. The integrated nature of the modern suburban home meant that an open garage door often provided direct, unsecured access to the house itself. Initially, building such a device required a fair amount of electronics knowledge. But as the 1980s progressed, the components became cheaper and more accessible. Articles in hobbyist electronics magazines sometimes detailed how to build frequency scanners and simple transmitters, and the knowledge began to spread. The threat of code grabbing shifted from a theoretical vulnerability to a practical and widely publicized security risk. News reports began to feature stories of suburban burglaries accomplished with these easily constructed gadgets. The very device that was meant to provide convenience and a sense of modern security had become a potential liability. The garage door opener industry was now faced with a serious challenge. Their primary selling points were convenience and security, and the foundation of that security was crumbling. The first attempts by manufacturers to address the problem were incremental improvements on the existing fixed code system. They increased the number of dip switches from 8 to 10, and then to 12. This increased the number of possible codes from 256 to 4,096. While this made it less likely for neighbors to interfere with each other, it did absolutely nothing to solve the fundamental problem of code grabbing. A code grabber didn't care if there were 1,000 codes or 1,000,000. It only needed to record and replay the one specific code that the homeowner was using. Another early approach was known as multi-code systems. Some manufacturers designed remotes that could be programmed with 2 or 3 different dip switch codes. The user would have to press a sequence of buttons, perhaps button 1 then button 2, which would transmit 2 different fixed codes in a row. The receiver would be programmed to only open the door if it received those specific codes in that specific order. This added a thin layer of complexity, but was still vulnerable. A slightly more sophisticated code grabber could simply record both transmissions and play them back in the correct sequence. The core vulnerability remained. The codes being transmitted were static and predictable. The industry needed a paradigm shift. The solution would not come from adding more switches or more codes, but from fundamentally changing the nature of the code itself. The goal was to create a system where the code transmitted by the remote was different every single time the button was pressed. If a code was only valid for a single use, then capturing it with a code grabber would be useless. Replaying an old, used code would have no effect. This concept is known as a rolling code, or sometimes a hopping code. The theoretical basis for rolling code technology lies in the field of cryptography, the science of secure communication. The challenge was to develop a cryptographic system that was robust enough to be secure, simple enough to be implemented on an inexpensive microchip, and low-powered enough to run for months or years on a small battery inside a remote control. The breakthrough came in the late 1980s and early 1990s, with the development of specialized algorithms and microcontrollers designed specifically for this purpose. A rolling code system consists of several key components working in concert. First, and most importantly, is a shared secret. At the factory, both the remote control transmitter and the garage door opener's receiver are programmed with the same unique secret cryptographic key. This key is a long binary number, perhaps 40 or 64 bits long, that is stored in a protected area of memory on the microchips of both devices. This secret key is never, under any circumstances, transmitted over the air. It is the foundation upon which the entire security of the system is built. Second is a synchronizable counter. Both the remote and the receiver maintain a counter in their memory. Every time the button on the remote is pressed, This counter is incremented by 1. The receiver also has its own counter that it expects to be synchronized with the remote's counter. Third is the cryptographic algorithm itself. This is a mathematical function, a sort of digital scrambling process, that takes two inputs, the current value of the counter and the secret key. It then produces a unique, scrambled output, which is the rolling code that gets transmitted. This process is deterministic. Given the same key and the same counter value, the algorithm will always produce the exact same output. However, it is also designed to be a one-way function. It is computationally easy to calculate the output from the inputs, but it is virtually impossible to determine the secret key or the counter value just by looking at the output. Here is how the process works in practice. When the homeowner presses the button on their remote, the microchip inside wakes up. It reads the current value of its internal counter. Let's say the value is 1000. It then takes this counter value, 1000, and the pre-programmed secret key and feeds them into the cryptographic algorithm. The algorithm generates a new encrypted code. This code is then transmitted via the radio signal to the receiver in the garage. The remote then increments its internal counter to 1001 and saves this new value, waiting for the next button press. Meanwhile, the receiver in the garage, which is also programmed with the exact same secret key, is listening. It receives the encrypted code from the remote. The receiver's microchip then performs its own calculation. It knows that the last successful code it received corresponded to a counter value of 999, so it anticipates that the next code should correspond to a counter value of 1000. It takes its own copy of the secret key and this expected counter value, 1000, and runs them through the identical cryptographic algorithm. If the result of its own calculation matches the code it just received from the remote, it knows the transmission is authentic. The receiver then opens the garage door and updates its own counter to 1000, ready for the next transmission. If a code grabber were to capture the transmission corresponding to counter value 1000, it would be useless. The next time the homeowner uses their remote, the counter will be 1001, and an entirely new, different encrypted code will be generated and transmitted. If the thief tries to replay the captured code, the one from counter 1000, the receiver will reject it. The receiver is now expecting a code based on counter value 1001. The old code is stale and invalid. This elegant system, however, presented a new and significant engineering challenge: synchronization. What happens if the homeowner presses the button on the remote while they are out of range of the garage? For instance, a child might be playing with the remote in the house, or the button might be accidentally pressed in a pocket or a purse while at the grocery store. In this scenario, the remote's internal counter would be incremented. If the button were pressed 10 times while out of range, the remote's counter would now be 10 steps ahead of the receiver's counter. The next time the homeowner pulls into the driveway and presses the button, the remote would transmit a code based on its new, advanced counter value. The receiver, expecting a code based on its old counter value, would find that the codes do not match, and the door would fail to open. The remote and receiver would be desynchronized. To solve this critical problem, the engineers of these new systems developed the concept of a look-ahead window. The receiver was designed to not just check for a single exact match. Instead of calculating the expected code for only the very next counter value, the receiver calculates the expected codes for a range of future counter values. This range is the window. For example, upon receiving a transmission, the receiver might calculate the valid codes for the next 256 possible counter values. It then compares the received code against this entire list of 256 valid codes. If the received code matches any of the codes within this window, the transmission is accepted as authentic, and the door opens. More importantly, the receiver then resynchronizes itself. It updates its own internal counter to match the counter value that the remote just used. For instance, if the receiver's counter was at 1000, and it received a valid code corresponding to a counter value of 1010, it would accept the code, since 1010 is within its 256-step window, open the door, and then jump its own counter forward to 1010. This makes the system resilient to accidental button presses. The user would likely never even notice that a resynchronization had occurred. The door would simply open as expected. The size of this window is a trade-off. A larger window provides more resilience against desynchronization, but requires slightly more processing power and memory in the receiver, and in a theoretical sense, infinitesimally reduces the overall security, though in practice the security remains exceptionally high. One of the most influential and widely adopted rolling code technologies was keylock, an algorithm developed by Frederick Brewer in South Africa in the mid-1980s, and later acquired and productized by Microchip Technology Inc., an American manufacturer of microcontrollers. The keylock system was a masterpiece of efficient and effective security designed for resource-constrained environments, like a battery-powered remote. It utilized a block cipher, which is a type of cryptographic algorithm that encrypts a fixed-size block of data. In the case of keylock, it typically used a 32-bit block. The secret key was 64 bits long, offering an immense number of possible keys, 2 to the power of 64, making a brute force attack where an attacker tries every possible key, computationally infeasible. The internal workings of the keylock algorithm relied on a nonlinear feedback shift register, NLFSR, a common component in stream ciphers that can produce long sequences of pseudo-random bits. The algorithm would perform a series of 528 rounds of mixing and substitution operations on the counter value, using the secret key to guide the process. The result was a highly scrambled, unpredictable 32-bit code. The beauty of the keylock system was that Microchip Technology implemented the entire algorithm in hardware on a tiny, low-cost microcontroller. This made it incredibly easy for garage door opener manufacturers to integrate this high-level security into their products. Without having to become cryptography experts themselves, they could simply buy the keylock chipset from Microchip. This leads us to the critical phase of standardization in the 1990s. The transition from insecure DIP switches to secure rolling codes was not mandated by a government body or an industry standards committee in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a market-driven standardization propelled by a handful of major players responding to a clear consumer need for enhanced security. The Chamberlain Group, the parent company of brands like LiftMaster and Craftsman, who made openers for Sears, was a primary driver of this change. In 1993, they introduced their first rolling code system, branding it Security Plus. The marketing was clear and effective, directly addressing the fears of code grabbing. Advertisements and packaging highlighted the fact that the code changed with every use, making it virtually impossible for thieves to steal. Hot on their heels was the Genie Company, which introduced its own rolling code system in 1995. They branded their technology IntelliCode. Both Security Plus and IntelliCode were based on the same underlying principles of rolling code cryptography, and in many cases, they used the same keylock chipset from Microchip Technology. While the branding was different, the core technology was becoming standardized by virtue of a shared, superior solution provided by a key component supplier. This rapid adoption created a new set of complexities during a transitional period in the mid to late 1990s. For a time, the market was fragmented. There were still millions of older, DIP switch-based systems in use. New homes were being built with rolling code systems. A homeowner might have an old DIP switch opener on one garage bay and a new Security Plus opener on the other. This created a demand for universal remote controls, capable of controlling both types of openers. These universal remotes were more complex, containing the circuitry to either transmit a fixed DIP switch code or to be programmed and paired with a modern rolling code receiver. The process of pairing, or learning, a new remote to a rolling code opener was itself a crucial part of the security protocol. With the old DIP switch systems, programming a new remote was a manual process of physically matching the switch settings. With rolling code, the process was digital. The opener's receiver unit would have a Learn button. When this button was pressed, the receiver would enter a programming mode for a short period, perhaps 30 seconds. During this time, the user would press the button on the new remote. The remote would transmit a special initialization packet containing its unique serial number. The receiver would then store this serial number in its memory and, using a secure key exchange method, would share the secret 64-bit key with that specific remote. From that point on, the receiver would only accept rolling code transmissions from remotes with serial numbers that it had stored in its memory. This prevented a neighbor, who also had a Security Plus system, from being able to open your garage door. Each pairing was unique. As the 1990s drew to a close, the rolling code system had become the undisputed industry standard for all new garage door opener installations in the United States. The older dip switch systems were now considered legacy technology. The sale of simple code grabbers plummeted as they became increasingly useless against the new generation of openers. The frequency allocation, however, remained largely in the same part of the radio spectrum governed by FCC Part 15. But what was being transmitted on those frequencies had been transformed. Frequencies like 390 MHz, which once carried simple, static passwords, now carried a sophisticated, encrypted, single-use digital token. By the year 2000, the transition was largely complete. The meticulous process of development, from the initial recognition of a security flaw to the invention, refinement, and mass-market adoption of a cryptographic solution, had run its course. It was a quiet revolution, one that most homeowners were only vaguely aware of through marketing terms like Security Plus or IntelliCode. They didn't need to understand the intricacies of block ciphers, synchronization counters, or look-ahead windows. They only needed to know that when they pressed the button, their garage door would reliably and securely open for them, and for no one else. The story of the standardization of garage door remote technology is a microcosm of a larger trend in late 20th century consumer electronics. It is a story of how increasing microprocessor power and falling costs allowed for the integration of sophisticated security features into everyday household objects. It is a story of how a specific societal context, the American suburb with its car-centric culture and integrated garages, created a unique security challenge, and it is a story of how a market-driven, competitive response, rather than a top-down mandate, led to a robust and universal standard. The silent, invisible conversation between the remote and the receiver had evolved from a simple shout of a fixed password in a public square to a whispered, encrypted secret, a new one spoken with every press of the button. This intricate dance of cryptography, electronics, and regulation ensured that the largest door to the American home remained a secure and convenient portal, all thanks to a meticulous and perhaps wonderfully boring process of technological standardization. And now, as the gentle hum of the motor ceases and the garage door settles into place, a quiet security descends upon the home. A security built not on heavy locks, but on the elegant logic of a constantly changing code, a silent guardian of the suburban night.